The story of Atlantis has intrigued humanity for millennia. It has confounded the experts and brought wonderment to the general public. Ever since Plato described in great detail the history and demise of that Atlantean empire in his writings of Critias and Timaeus from around 400 BC. So if the story is real history, why and when did the Atlantean Empire crumble? And why have we heard so few details about this dominant economic and military force of the ancient world? Were the ancient Atlanteans star mappers and earth mappers back in the Ice Age, as some historians suggest? Did Atlanteans have the capacity for space travel, and did they disappear through some vortex-like wormhole? Or were they destroyed by some galactic upheaval, as some mythologists suggest? Does the story of Atlantis even confirm some biblical accounts of the Book of Genesis? This documentary explores the newly discovered, down-to-earth findings of several offshore sites now considered to be a part of the ancient Atlantean Empire, and considers their implications for the timing of when Atlantis was consumed by the sea. These findings also show that this ancient civilization, founded by the legendary figure Atlas, must have had highly advanced and accurate mapping methods which enabled these Atlanteans to successfully measure and map the Earth, thereby allowing them the ability to navigate to far-flung locations throughout the world, representing an empire of global proportions that was wiped out at the end of the Ice Age.
I absolutely do think that the story of Atlantis fits into real history. And just to put that in context, if we look at what mainstream scholars regard as the recent history of the Earth, everybody is agreed that there was an event called the last Ice Age, and that the last Ice Age came to an end rather cataclysmically about 12,000 years ago. The story of Atlantis, if we go back to the original source of the story of Atlantis, the earliest surviving source to have come down to us is the Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato, who of course knew nothing about ice ages, nevertheless set the demise of Atlantis precisely at the time that the vast ice sheets that covered huge areas of the Earth were melting down and pouring their meltwater into the oceans and raising sea levels by 400 feet all around the world.
There are over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And the idea that there's over 200 sunken cities in the Mediterranean is indicative that the whole Atlantic and the Mediterranean were flooded in some kind of catastrophe. These ruins are associated often with Atlantis. There's a certain type of polygonal megalithic construction that's very distinct. And you see this in these ruins that are still above water, but you see the same kind of construction in these underwater ruins too.
Here there are two dolmens. Menge is the biggest in the world, it's 5,000 years old and is for the burial chamber too. We think that they buried 500 people inside of the dolmen of Menge. And the stone at the end, on top, is the biggest used in a prehistory monument from all the world too. The weight of this stone is 180 tons.
Megalithic building with gigantic sculpted stones is considered by almost all the experts to have begun around 2500 BC. From the Great Pyramid of Giza, to Stonehenge in England, to Baalbek of the ancient Canaanites, and even to the dolmens and citadels of southern Spain.
The dolmen of Viera, this is the dolmen of Viera. This dolmen is 4,500 years old and it's for the burial chamber, like a tomb, prehistory tomb. In this dolmen you have two clearly different parts. The long corridor, and at the end it has a chamber for the burial. We think it's only for one person or one family, probably for the chief of the village that live here. and this is the only one of the 3 of Antequera that is in the line of the summer solstice. One day of a year, the sunlight is coming through all the dolmen until the end of the chamber, 23rd of June.
All across the southern plain of Spain are these megalithic dolmens, Hormazo buildings, and they are at the base of what later would be built upon the structures by the Romans. They were the base structures at Nibla, Ronda at southern Spain, which were on rivers in the mountainous areas of the Sierra Morena Mountains, which is the richest mining area, the most ancient and richest mining area in the entire world. Now this was the source of the wealth for the Atlanteans. They would bring this copper ore and tin ore and silver ore and gold ore down the rivers to Seville, and that was the Atlantean plain.
One form of megalithic construction that is found all over the world is known as Cyclopean. And Cyclopean construction is giant granite or some other stone boulders that have been shaped and are usually fitted together in a jigsaw pattern where the stones are perfectly fitted and locked in together. We can find it in Spain, we can find it in Greece, in Turkey, in the Middle East. We can even find it in Mexico and other areas. And the similarity of this unusual type of construction, in my mind, is evidence of a singular source for this construction method, and I believe that is Atlantis.
So off the coast of southern Spain are submerged megaliths in like at least 5 sites. Off of Lixus, Morocco, west of Gibraltar, off of Tarifa, which is right near Gibraltar, off of Huelva, Rota, and Chipiona. Submerged megaliths in 50 to 100 feet of water, which are of the megalithic, well-hewn rock forms, walls, citadels, paving stones for streets, the whole bit, discovered at these 4 locations offshore, submerged when the Ice Age ended.
The capital city of Atlantis was a canal city with concentric canals and rings leading in to an inner city and port area. And Plato describes the city of Atlantis very specifically this way. The city of Carthage, built in Tunisia by the Phoenicians, was in many ways a miniature model of the capital city of Atlantis, with also these concentric circles and canals leading to an inner city. In many ways, Carthage was a rebuilding of the ancient capital of Atlantis.
Carthage in the ancient language is pronounced Kart Hadash, and that means new city. So it was a copy of the old city, Atlantis, somewhere near in the Gibraltar area. It was a direct copy of Atlantis. Now, the common thought process is that Atlantis went under about 10,000 years ago, and that Carthage was built around 1000 BC. So the ancients waited 9,000 years to make the new city, the replica, the copy of Atlantis. They waited 8,000, 9,000 years to do that, to replicate it. Seems very doubtful to me.
Another thing that a lot of your Atlantean researchers will point to is the cross of Atlantis, is the symbol of Atlantis derived from Plato's description of the central city of Atlantis. The cross of Atlantis shows 3 concentric rings with a cross in the center with a canal emerging from the cross. And this is, again, thought to be a description of the central city of Atlantis. But what I've noticed is that when you look at the cross of Atlantis with the 2-dimensional image of the concentric rings, symbolically a 2-dimensional image of the concentric rings represents a 3-dimensional experience. The 2D concentric rings represents a 3-dimensional vortex. And nobody seems to talk about Atlantis as being a vortex or a gateway that leads into other realms. But that's exactly what I think it was.
I believe that Atlantis was a maritime civilization. and I believe it was based on coastlines and that it was globally distributed. I think it was all over the world. I think it was virtually everywhere, but it was on coastlines. And the reason that so little evidence that historians will accept have come down to us is because those coastlines were all submerged and are now under 100 feet of water since the end of the last ice age, and nobody has looked there. So I think actually the influence of a great lost civilization is to be found all around the world, and I think one of the places in which it was very active was in the Mediterranean and in the eastern side of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean.
If I were looking for Atlantis, again, although I've spent my life doing that, I would make a beeline for Spain. And I would go toward Gibraltar and Tangier in Africa, because that's where Plato said Atlantis was. Anyone who reads Plato's dialogues knows that Atlantis lay beyond the gates of Hercules, one of which is Gibraltar, one of which is Tangier.
The extent of Atlantis, as described by Plato, is outside and inside the Pillars of Hercules. So that obviously is not just an island. It was a coastline. Plato said that it extended from the Gibraltar east all the way to the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is Italy, and to Libya, and to the west, outside of the Pillars of Hercules, along the coastlines, all along northwest Africa, as well as southwestern Spain. So it was not just an island. The main city of Poseidon was submerged, and it may be one of these three now off the coast of southern Spain at Tarifa, Huelva, Chipiona, and Rota.
These Atlanteans were savvy ancient mappers whose leader, the legendary Atlas, has always been associated with sophisticated mapping. Atlas and his fleets were well known in the ancient world as successful navigators and mappers of vast expanses of oceans and their coastlines for trade and military conquest. They used a little-known ancient method with which they could sail away and successfully find their way back to their base ports, presumably in the Gibraltar area near the Atlas Mountains of Morocco and the rich mining districts of southern Spain.
You go to Egypt and you go to the so-called Solar Boat Museum. Here's a boat built for Khufu, supposedly builder of the Great Pyramid, 2500 BC. It's as advanced as anything up to and maybe even including the clipper ships. This boat could go anywhere, and if people had knowledge of the stars, and it is now becoming quite clear that they did have knowledge of the stars. So if they knew navigation, in a boat of this sort, you could get anywhere. America, Australia, any place.
The earliest ocean-going ships, such as Khufu's ship, were built in this time frame when Old Kingdom Egypt began to flourish, around 2500 BC. The Phoenicians of Canaan, world-renowned navigators, were also beginning to build their ships at this time. Even the ancient Greeks began to build huge trireme ships mentioned by Plato in his epic account of the warfare between the Atlanteans and the Greeks, the dominant maritime empires at this time. These ancient shipbuilding civilizations are now considered to have easily been able to navigate and exploit the lands on both sides of the Atlantic, with guidance from Atlas's mapping method.
According to the ancient Aztec legends, the original homeland of the Aztecs was a mysterious and lost land called Atlan. And the word Atlan is in fact part of the word Atlantis. So the idea too that the Aztecs' mysterious homeland that they left was somehow in Spain, off the coast of Spain, perhaps even the Basque areas of Spain, I think is a theory that deserves some thinking about.
Whenever the archaeologists get to work digging up ancient ruins, it's very often that something, for example, the Mayan temples, as they keep digging, they find that, okay, the current temples are built, let's say, 800, 900 AD, but they dig down deeper and deeper and they're finding things 2000, 3000 BC.
The most ancient structures of Central America, from the ancient Olmecs and the pre-Mayans, are from around 2,000 to 3,000 BC. Megalithic Cyclopean structures. The Dutch in that area of Western Europe call a submerged lost civilization in their lore Atlant. So we see this term ATL, Atlantic Atlan, from the Mayans all the way across to Europe. So it seems to be a common seafaring culture at around 2000 BC.
Yes, this is a very interesting point, is the references that we find from Central America to a place called Atlan, which seemed to be the home civilization from which the later historical civilization of Central America sprang. It's impossible to resist the connection between those references to a lost land called Atlan and to Plato's notion of Atlantis.
And then there's the work of Barry Fell back in the 70s America BC that makes it quite clear, at least back as far as the Phoenicians, but maybe further back than that, they were routinely visiting the New World. Again, in academia that I often like to call quackademia, this is considered illegitimate to even suggest that these ancient people were capable of intercourse with each other in terms of trade or commerce or whatever.
These ancient ruins of southern Mexico, later built upon by the Mayans, were cyclopean megalithic structures and are strikingly similar to those ancient structures of Lixus on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, as well as those of southern Spain, the region generally considered to have been the home base of the Atlantean Empire. This region includes the Basque country of Spain, whose people not only claim a lineage from the Atlanteans, but also refer to their lost kingdom as Atlantica.
Interesting too, along those lines, that the Basque language, which is very unique, is also a very similar language to the Aztec language known as Nahuatl. Both the Basque language and the Aztec language has a very curious combination of X sounds and ATL sounds, atl, quatl, kakakakakal. So when you have this Aztec language and the Basque language compared, we find a lot of curious similarities.
The suffix atl, spelled ATL, found at the end of some Mexican words, means water, and the ancient Mexican homeland is said to have been Atlan, across the water to the eastern Atlantic. So the connection to an Atlantean civilization is unavoidable. These Atlanteans quite obviously had the navigating savvy to get the job done, with a little-known ancient mapping method which allowed the surprisingly accurate mapping of many parts of the world in ancient times, even during the Ice Age.
And very interestingly, there's a whole category of maps produced between the 15th and the 17th century based on lost sources, which show the world with astonishing accuracy as it looked during the last Ice Age. I'll give you an example of this. Off the west coast of Ireland, you can find on maps from the 15th century a little circular island appears, which they call High Brazil. Such an island did not exist in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries of our era. But if you reconstruct the coastlines of the world as they looked when sea level was much lower, as it was during the last Ice Age, you find that an island was exposed above sea level in exactly the place that is indicated on those maps. How did they know it was there unless somebody was there to map it?
These Sea King maps show accurate east-west distances, and that requires a knowledge, an accurate knowledge of time. You have to measure time to get that. Now, they didn't have clocks back then. They didn't have timepieces at 2000, 3000 BC, so they had to have another mechanism by which they could measure time. And that mechanism is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which would cycle once in 25,920 years. And with this rate of the wobble of the Earth's axis, the constellations of the zodiac appear to move along the horizon. They knew this rate, therefore they could measure time and therefore measure east-west distances.
For example, in Western times, the longitude was only developed and discovered, or let's say made precise, I think it's somewhere in the 1700s, 1750 or something of that nature. But there's increasing evidence that the ancients understood this full well. Moreover, where the evidence really gets commanding is when it becomes clear that the Egyptians had measured the earth, because the understanding of those measures is what gives rise to the ancient measuring system of cubits, and this is, again, universal.
Well, the references to units of measurement is the measurement that is expressed in the Great Pyramid. I think actually that the ancient Egyptian cubit is likely to turn out to be what is called an earth commensurate measure, that it is derived from an ancient system of measuring based on the knowledge of the dimensions of the earth.
The circumference of the earth is 21,600 nautical miles. And the base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile. So the circumference of the earth is 43,200 base perimeter lengths. So it's an earth commensurate measurement. And the royal cubit was derived by subdividing that half nautical mile. Now, the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid is 440 royal cubits per base side. There's 4 sides, so multiply 440 by 4, and you get 1,760. Now you divide 1,760 into half a nautical mile, and you get your 20.632 inches. So it's an earth commensurate measurement.
There's no doubt whatsoever that the Great Pyramid of Egypt does embody the dimensions of the earth. If you take the measurement of the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, go along and measure each of its 4 sides and add that together, and then you multiply that number by 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the equatorial circumference of the earth to within a few miles of the value that we have today. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the polar radius of the earth, in other words, of the distance from the center of the earth to the North Pole. Now this is really quite remarkable.
The earth and night sky were viewed as a sphere within a sphere by several ancient civilizations. In the ancient book of the Mexicans, the Popol Vuh, it is written that the ancients could measure the round face of the earth and the arch of the sky. Even Plato referred to the earth as a sphere within the celestial sphere. As a result of the slow wobble over the earth's axis, the sphere of the night sky appears to move at a constant rate of 72 years per 1 degree, known as precession. These Atlantean star mappers were apparently able to predict where on Earth the constellations of the night sky would appear at the same position, relative to the horizon. So, with this knowledge, the ancients related time to distance, the same principle upon which is based our modern nautical mile system, with arc minutes and arc seconds.
The notion or the knowledge of precession of the equinox, that's another matter that's becoming better and better established almost by the day, that the ancients knew about precession of the equinoxes way back when and write it into their legends and mythologies.
Precession of the equinox is also known as lunisolar precession, is the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the Earth's equator, causing a wobble, a little like a falling top, if you like. I think that they were able to measure the rate of precession with the instrument that I've rediscovered. And so yes, I do think so, and I think that they created what was known as the Great Year, which is in many cultures 25,920 years, which is one roll of the precession, if you like, one orbit of the precession. And that they broke them down into 12, and 12 is the zodiac signs, and each of those is 2,160 years long.
It appears that the ancients did have a method of understanding the earth in a different way than we do today. A good example is Plato's remark that if you could see the true earth from afar, it would appear as a 12-angle pyramid, as a 12-patched leather ball is the way he described it. And so you get this picture that they had this incredible consciousness. They had a highly advanced degree of consciousness that was not earth-based. Much of their knowledge was based upon a viewpoint of the earth, looking at it from the outside in.
The duration of the 12 zodiac ages, 2,160 years each, is 1/12 of the amount of time that it would take for the Earth to wobble once as it spins and revolves around the Sun, totaling 25,920 years. So the ancients, including the Egyptians and Atlanteans, were clearly able to measure the Earth by measuring the apparent movement of the constellations across the night sky. Recent research by several authorities has also revealed that the Earth's dimensions are embodied in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which experts now consider was used as the ancient prime meridian, as indicated on several ancient maps.
Certainly on the instrument that I've got that I can show to you, it's 3 arc minutes. And 3 arc minutes would allow anybody observing the precession of the equinoxes to figure out the rate of movement within a period of 9 years of observation.
Accuracy of 3 arc minutes is accuracy to within 0.5%. This level of accuracy is, not coincidentally, the same level of accuracy achieved in surveying the half-nautical mile base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid of Giza. These structural measurements of the Great Pyramid is an almost perfect reduction of the dimensions of the Earth by a factor of 43,200. The Great Pyramid was almost certainly the embodiment of this very precise ancient precession mapping technique, and it was the base reference point for mapping the ancient world. Today, Greenwich, England is the base reference point for timekeeping and also nautical mile mapping, which is based upon the relationship of time to distance, as was the ancient system based at Giza in Egypt that was derived from precession timekeeping.
I think the evidence really is from the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Essenes measured the lunar calendar. But if you go back to Egypt, then obviously we talk about Thoth, Thoth meaning wisdom. And he was also god of the moon. So we can see that he involved himself in weights and measures and writing and language and all of those things, and it also says he involved himself in the moon. So measurement of the moon is the only body in the sky that's retrograde at a rate that's measurable by the eye.
Plato says that Atlantis went under 9,000 years before his time, which would put it at around 10,000 BC. However, in the ancient world, the lunar calendar was very popular. The lunar calendar was their day-to-day calendar. Now, Plato received this story about Atlantis through 4 layers of oral renderings, initially from Egypt. So during those 4 renderings, the translation could have been lost. Did they mean lunar calendar or solar calendar? Now the evidence does fit the lunar calendar rendering, 9,000 lunar cycles before his time, which would put the Atlantis within historical times. So this to me makes much more sense.
Also, to navigate the world, they had incredible knowledge of the stars, of geography. In 1902, they found in a Greek shipwreck a device called the Antikythera mechanism. And today it is in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, Greece. It was years of study that they found that this device had cogged wheels with hundreds of interconnected machines, and it was a very intricate device, literally a computer that dialed up the stars and was used for very sophisticated navigation.
This Antikythera mechanism had many bronze gears, which replicated the various cycles of the sun, moon, planets, and stars in their cohesive movements. Therefore, this device could realistically predict their future positions. This mechanism had 2 concentric scales on the front, one for the Greek solar cycle and the other for the Egyptian lunar-based Sothic cycle. It is therefore altogether possible that the solar or lunar cycles of Plato's 9,000 so-called years back to Atlantis could have been confused before the story even got to Plato. Also, according to Plato's accounts, the Greek kings Erechtheus, Cecrops, and Erecthonius ruled at roughly the same time as the destruction of Atlantis. These kings are commonly thought by historians of ancient Greece to have ruled around 1500 BC, certainly not 10,000 BC. So 9,000 lunar cycles before Plato's time more logically fits the timeline of his accounts, while 9,000 solar cycles does not.
I don't think that Plato made anything up. I take Plato extremely seriously. And I think since our historians take Plato seriously in almost everything else he says, we ought to take him seriously on the issue of Atlantis. And if you take apart what Plato is saying, he's talking about a great global civilization which had a strong influence in the Mediterranean area. Plato didn't know about the Ice Age, but he did know that a great flood took place at that time. To my mind, that adds a great deal of credibility to everything that he said.
With the conventional date proposed by mainstream scientists for the end of the Ice Age at 10,000 BC, Greece would have been about 8,000 years away from the reigns of these three kings, and huge trireme ships of the Atlantis story appear 8,000 years later, at around 2000 BC. These conflicts in Plato's accounts cannot be resolved satisfactorily by mainstream academicians, and such conflicts in dating cannot explain the Cyclopean megalithic structures that were submerged at the end of the Ice Age. Plato's descriptions of the Atlantean Empire were so detailed that they are reflected even in biblical references. Southern Spain is also called the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas and granddaughters of Poseidon, Atlas's father. As Poseidon means father Sidon, and as Sidon was a son of Canaan, we see that the Atlantean people first came from the eastern Mediterranean, from the land of Canaan, a port city of which was Sidon. Cadiz, a city in southern Spain where an offshore site was located, was named after another son of Poseidon, Gades. So the tie-in of these so-called mythological Atlantean characters with biblical accounts is now becoming apparent to ancient historians.
Southern Spain is known as the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas, a supposedly mythological figure, but Atlas was the man of maps. He was this precession measurer who measured and mapped the earth, among others with him, the Atlanteans. And their base of operations was Tarshish, the biblical Tarshish. The Spaniards today know that Seville, which was anciently known as Tartessus, previous to that was known as Tharsin or Tharsis. That's the Tarshish of the Bible, the great merchants of southern Spain. This area also known as the Hesperides. These were the Phoenicians, the same as the Atlanteans, circa 2000 BC.
Phoenician sailors were under pain of death to keep the trade routes secret, particularly the trade routes that went out into the Atlantic. Their trade routes went to Spain, up to France, and to Cornwall, where the tin and copper trade was flourishing. What the Phoenicians did was try to keep their trade routes a secret, and so they fostered these ideas that the Atlantic was impassable to other ships, so that only their ships would have the courage and the knowledge to go beyond the Straits of Hercules into the Atlantic.
Plato also elaborates on the gold, copper, silver, and tin mines of the Sierra Morena Mountains of southern Spain, which were by far the richest in the ancient world. It is presumed that they were the lifeblood of the Atlantean shipping empire with its mineral wealth, and these Atlanteans clearly had the ability to transport these minerals to the eastern Mediterranean to trade with the Greeks, Minoans, Canaanites, and Egyptians. So it would seem that the Atlanteans of about 2000 BC were truly the dominant shipping and military power in the western Mediterranean and eastern Atlantic. Their empire most likely ranged from Gibraltar in the west, northward to the rich tin mines of Cornwall, England, where are found the now submerged sites referred to as Avalon, and eastward from Gibraltar to as far as Italy and Libya. The almost identical Cyclopean megalithic ruins found in those regions, both onshore and now submerged, support and confirm Plato's account.
I feel that what actually happened was that these people had a land which was bounded by the sea as opposed to bounded by the land. That they followed the trade routes of the trade wind routes as we know them today and the local Atlantic currents, and they travelled around the basin of the Atlantic Ocean. And so they existed on the peripheries of France, of Britain, of Scandinavia, and then down the coasts of Spain, round the north coasts of Africa, across from the Cape Verde Islands to Canaries, to the northern parts of America, the Caribbean, and back round the route again up from Newfoundland.
As evidenced by the submerged megalithic ruins found in various parts of the world, some of which are on the shallow seafloor of the Gibraltar region, off Spain at Tarifa, Chipiona, Rota, Huelva, as well as off Lixus, Morocco, it is only now becoming clear that the tremendous sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age consumed the coastline portions of these ancient civilizations, preeminent among them being these port and citadel structures of the Atlantean Empire.
One of the mysteries of ancient Egypt is the invasion of the Sea Peoples, who fought major naval battles with the Egyptians during the New Kingdom. Who these Sea People were, where they came from, is one of the great mysteries of history. It would seem that the Sea Peoples, in fact, came out of Northern Europe. They were coming out of Denmark, Northern Germany, areas of Holland that were to go underwater.
These sea people apparently began to migrate from their homelands along the shores of the eastern Atlantic and the western Mediterranean at a time that would coincide with the end of the Ice Age. Their own ports and coastal cities were being submerged when many experts now claim that the sea level rose at a rate of 3 feet per year for about 100 years, and tsunamis from the volcanic eruptions of Mount Etna and Santorini were surging onto the disappearing coastlines.
These areas of the world were being flooded, and the Sea Peoples themselves then migrated in boats through the Straits of Hercules into the Mediterranean, where they battled the Egyptians, and the Egyptians won that battle and defeated the Sea Peoples. This is a major turning point in Egyptian history. And the Sea Peoples then settled near to Egypt, but more around Greece, Turkey, and Lebanon.
Even Egypt was affected by the end of the Ice Age. Where are the submerged megalithic ruins of the ancient Egyptian port cities known as Heraklion and Meneuthus near Alexandria? Meneuthus, the namesake of that now submerged Egyptian megalithic city, was another son of Poseidon, as reported by Plato. According to ancient biblical legend, Sidon, known as Poseidon, which means Father Sidon, a son of Canaan, and his progeny, Atlas and Meneuthus among them, were building port cities from Sidon, Canaan, across the coast of North Africa, and all the way to Gibraltar and beyond. They were building their maritime trade empire with the ancient mapping knowledge of Atlas, the map man, who could measure and thereby map the earth with the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza being the reduced embodiment of the dimensions of the earth.
There are a number of scholars who contended that the Great Pyramid is a scale model of the Earth. And the earliest of those is a Greek. I'm not sure if it's Herodotus or Agatharcides, one of the ancient Greeks who mentioned that, because it was that had Isaac Newton send his colleague John Greaves down to Egypt to try and figure out if there was anything to that old legend.
The base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is almost precisely 1/2 a nautical mile, which is a reduction of the perimeter length of the Earth by a factor of 43,200, clearly indicating that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramid with that connection in mind. The dimensions of the Earth can only be measured by measuring time, which allows the measurement of longitudes, which are measurements of east-west distances. Because the ancient Egyptians didn't have accurate clocks to measure east-west distances, they needed a different timekeeping standard, which they apparently identified as the rate of the movement of the constellations along the horizon resulting from the slow wobble of the Earth's axis.
And then you see the rate of the precession of the equinoxes, 25,920. All of these simple things show that these people were measuring the size of their horizon, if you like, meaning time zone, related to themselves and to the stars as an exponential form of measurement. It's just a matter of rolling a wheel and converting the distance of a circumference into a straight line. They're very interesting, in truth, the Great Pyramid, because I can teach a child how to design a Great Pyramid instantly with the cross. Well, within 3 minutes, let's be fair, if a child of 5 can produce a perfect pyramid every time with simple geometry.
By triangulating where the constellations would appear in the future, according to their measured apparent rate of movement of 72 years per 1 degree, the ancients could pinpoint their location anywhere on Earth to within a 0.5% accuracy. So many distinct cultures and civilizations from different parts of the world integrated precession mapping numbers such as 12, 36, 54, 72, 108, and 432 into their respective ancient legends and architectures, indicating the scope of their knowledge and understanding of the earth and stars.
The Hindus, the Chinese, everybody had accurate and very advanced measuring systems based upon knowledge of the dimensions of the earth. This is now quite formal. The evidence over the course of a number of books by various scholars, many of them independent of each other, pretty well demonstrates that this was known. And this is another thorn in the side of academia, because if they know longitude, it means that they have an advanced and sophisticated science at their fingertips.
Some of the maps of the Ice Age Sea Kings show mapping reference points radiating from the area of the Upper Nile Delta, where the Great Pyramid is located. This indicates that the ancient prime meridian, the base reference point for the ancient navigators, extended through the location of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So it would seem that the Egyptians were not only master builders, but also adept navigators, like the Canaanite Phoenicians, some of whom were the Atlanteans.
The maps themselves testify to an ancient project to completely map the whole world. In order to map the whole world, you need big ships, which are capable of enormous journeys to actually visit all of these places around the world. These maps show the world in great detail as it looked during the last ice age, not in the Middle Ages. And these maps incorporate extremely accurate longitude relationships.
In the Middle Ages, a number of maps did exist of the Atlantic, and they often showed across the Atlantic a mysterious land known as Antilla, or the Antilles. And this area was associated with Atlantis. St. Brendan, other seafarers were known to go out into the Atlantic in search of this mysterious island of the Antilles. Later, historians and cartographers identified the Antilles with many of the Caribbean islands. And in fact, they're called the Antilles today.
The Greek philosopher Aristotle called the Phoenicians the Antilhas, who called themselves the Cana Anu, which means offspring of the Canaan. So, according to the biblical timeline, these ancient world navigators were operating as the Atlantean Empire during the Ice Age, which, according to conventional ancient historians, ended around 10,000 BC, but which now appears to have ended closer to 1,500 BC. This time frame also coincides with the exodus of the Hebrews out of Egypt, when the sea level was rising due to the melting of Ice Age ice packs, and the Middle East, Egypt, and the Indus Valley of India were drying out with the end of the Ice Age, causing the mass migration of people groups. Among them, the Sea People, who were the displaced Atlanteans as their civilization was being destroyed.
The way the Atlantean technology was lost is inferred by Plato, and he describes how they had a divine essence within them, and that over time this divine essence diminished. And when Zeus heard about this from his home in the center of the universe, as Plato describes, he sent his wrath. But if we extrapolate from that story and assume that even the center of the universe, by that he meant the center of the Milky Way galaxy, We do know that periodically galaxies go into what are called their active galactic nucleus phase, where they sprout out just these incredible cosmic energies. And there is evidence, according to some theoretical physicists and others, that Earth did suffer such a cataclysm. So I would go along with the idea that that was what actually caused the destruction of Atlantis, was this cyclical cataclysmic destruction, and literally destroyed the civilization of Atlantis.
Almost all would agree that Atlantis did succumb to the sea because of the end of the Ice Age, when the polar ice caps melted and the water poured into the sea, rapidly raising sea level and submerging all these megalithic structures which are now on the shallow seafloor. It's because the oceans had cooled to the point where that evaporation was not so great, so the dense cloud cover was no more, so the Ice Age ended, sea level rose. That's hydrology 101. Paradoxically, warmer ocean waters is the only way you can explain the dense cloud cover for the Ice Age.
So, were there really 8,000 years of missing history between the time that mainstream historians say the Ice Age ended at 10,000 BC and when they say this sophisticated megalithic building began onshore and presumably offshore as well at around 2000 BC? If so, what was going on during those 8,000 years? And why did the ancients wait 8,000 years before resuming their megalithic building and advanced navigation of the Earth?
Particularly as we discover more and more megalithic cities underwater, we're amassing better proof of this ancient civilization we'll call Atlantis. These cities just were not built underwater. They had to be built before these oceanic level changes. So whenever that was, that is, at least how ancient we can start to date these cities. And that is putting us back into this time frame of Atlantis.
Plato, a world-renowned scholar, people look to him as a source of truth and knowledge. Now, was Plato misinformed when he was told 9,000 solar years before his time for Atlantis to have gone under? Apparently so, because if we look at the evidence, it could not have been back at that time frame. So apparently he was misinformed. He should have written 9,000 lunar cycles before his time. Therefore, he would not appear to be misinformed as badly as he is with this 9,000 solar year before his times rendition that Atlantis went under. So we got to look hard at lunar cycles, and with that, Plato looks like the legitimate, fantastic scholar that he should rightfully be.
The submerged megalithic ruins of the Gibraltar area, as well as those off Egypt, Lebanon, Greece, India, and Japan, should be more fully investigated. But clearly, mainstream scientists and historians have shown a reluctance to do so, because they would have to rewrite their chronology of ancient history. These offshore sites were obviously the port cities of the ancient Atlantean civilization, which clearly flourished during the Ice Age, whose navigators measured and thereby mapped the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using the precession mapping methods used by Atlas, the founder of the legendary and truly historical maritime empire of Atlantis.